Hello and welcome, everyone. It's so great to have you here for the NCSS and Inquire Ed Spring Webinar Series. It's called the Spring Webinar Series, even though it probably doesn't feel like spring in many of the places you are right now. My name is Martin Andrews, Creative Director at Inquire Ed, and I'm so glad you could join us for the first webinar in this series, From State Adoption to Classroom Instruction, Making Social Studies Materials Matter. Please tune in for the next webinars in our series, Beyond Silos, Aligning Inclusive Instruction in Inquiry and Social Studies, and Making Time for Social Studies Elementary Priorities and Possibilities. As I mentioned, this series is brought to you by the National Council for the Social Studies and Inquire Ed. The National Council for the Social Studies is the nation's largest professional association dedicated exclusively to social studies education. And we have a deadline coming up. Each year, NCSS has a fabulous conference this year in my hometown of Chicago, December 4th through the 6th. And right now, proposal submissions are being accepted. You have roughly to the end of February to submit a proposal. You can do that at socialstudies.org/conference/proposals. You're going to want to check that out. Come see us in Chicago. Inquire Ed will definitely be there. As I did mention, the series is also brought to you by Inquire Ed. Inquire Ed supports teachers with high-quality instructional materials that make rigorous, joyful, and transferable learning possible for every student. Our elementary social studies curriculum, Inquiry Journeys, is used across the country to help students build deep content knowledge and develop those inquiry skills that are essential for our thriving democracy. You can find out more at inquireed.com. Reach out, scan the QR code. We would love to chat. Before we bring on our guests, I want to level set a little bit so that we know the context of what we're talking about when we're talking about this movement from standards to materials to classrooms. And what we're really talking about here is a very fractured system. First of all, states all adopt social studies standards. Timelines vary. And we've also seen timelines being blown up across the country. You think we're going to have a standards review and then it gets delayed. Second, we also know that some states have instructional materials reviews, but others don't. And that alone creates very different experiences for districts. In states that do review materials, some of those materials might be recommended or they might be required, often depending on how funding works in that state. And finally, every state seems to use a different rubric or different criteria to evaluate materials. And so right away, we can already see we're dealing with a lot of variation, which helps explain why this work can feel confusing or uneven. I think right now is a perfect opportunity to zoom in a little bit on one state, Oregon, to use it as a case study of that move from standards to materials to implementation. And that's why I'm so glad to welcome on Amit Kobrowski. He is the social science specialist for the Oregon Department of Education. And prior to joining ODE, Amit taught high school social studies for 24 years. Amit, we're really glad that you're here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining us. And for those in our audience who may be unfamiliar, where is Oregon right now on that standards material classroom implementation journey?
Yeah, great question. We adopted our new standards in 2024, and then we give some time for instructional materials identification. So we sought out high quality instructional materials from publishers. We do run a review process. We're one of the states that has that process. And so we were able to complete that process and identify high quality instructional materials this last summer in 2025. That list has been out for our districts to take a look at. And then the required implementation year for the new standards is in 2026.
2026.
Yeah, so we will, starting this new school year coming up, we will have schools reporting on the implementation of their new standards.
Yeah. Now, you're also a member, I know, of CS4 with a lot of different state leaders. Is Is that process generally did you look at other states and other timelines for when you were thinking about that move from standards to materials to implementation?
I think states are similar, who especially those that have a materials review process that the state runs. For Oregon, I can just say that it's actually the materials adoption process that's regulated by rule instead of the standards, right? So we update the materials until now every 7 years.
Okay.
And that gives us an opportunity then to revise the standards. And so that, although the process ends up starting with the standards revision, it's really driven by the instructional materials requirement. And then thinking about the implementation, giving schools time to hopefully do PD and maybe pilot some materials. That's what sets the timeline there. And I think that is pretty similar in other states, although their driving mechanism might be different.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that the materials review because I think we hear and see a lot that that move from standards to materials to classroom can feel like a game of telephone where something is lost at each step. And I'm thinking about like maybe a standard that is based on the first dimension of the C3 framework. We want students to develop the capability to construct supporting questions and compelling questions. And in the standard, that's spelled out. And then when it gets translated to the material, we could see that just being a question that's slapped onto the unit that the students don't really interact with. And then as we get down to the classroom, it could manifest itself in a wonder wall for questions, which is great, but that's not getting to the depth of that inquiry standard. And I wonder how you constructed your rubric to try to maintain that depth of meaning from the standard to the materials that you were reviewing.
Yeah, so we constructed this set of criteria with rubrics for each of the components of the Oregon standards for social science, but then also there's a few pieces of the criteria that are applied to each of the content areas. So things like access for students and students seeing themselves in the curriculum, those kind of pieces are like across the board for Oregon. And then for specific things, what we were looking for was the criteria that we created was to make sure that the instructional materials really addressed the essential disciplinary practices, which we have, right, which are closer to what you were talking about with the C3 framework. Some of the skills and really our essential disciplinary practices are like pedagogical approaches to social science. And the criteria were built so that we'd be looking for scaffolding and structures of support for teachers to be able to implement inquiry-driven questions and ways to help students think of multiple perspectives, et cetera. And then the standards themselves provided lots of content examples, which was the newest part of our standards, was to add this idea of having a standard, but then having at least 3 examples that could be used to teach to that standard. And so in the criteria, we also talked about, does it reach to the depth of knowledge that we want our teachers to be able to address using the standard? And so I think that process was really helpful for publishers as they saw our criteria that came out about 6 months before the window opened for publishers to submit. So we were able to share the criteria with publishers. And so they could see the standards, they could see the criteria. And I think that's part of what made for a very successful review process. And we had a number of publishers that were able to qualify.
You pointed out something there, and I want to dig into a little bit to see how you explain the difference between what often happens is the set of standards comes down and there's a set of inquiry standards often in states, and there's a set of content standards. I think you call those, the inquiry standards would be the essential disciplinary practices. They would fall under that. But what we often see is that districts, schools, teachers are treating those as like a one-to-one. So we see like a inquiry standard uses primary and secondary sources or vets primary and secondary sources, questions the legitimacy of primary, secondary sources, seeing that as equal as like one content standard. And those are 2 very different things. Like you said, one is the how you do social studies, and the other is a piece of information that you can investigate. How do you explain that difference to people when they're making a choice? Because it seems like one can be added in a way, and one is so essential that you cannot do without it.
Yeah, so I think for our essential disciplinary practices, we have 10, and they're for every grade level, right? So they appear at the front of the standards and then they appear at the top of each grade. And the idea, again, is there's intended to give some guidance or direction to teachers about how they want to be presenting the information that's in the standards themselves. And whether I'm just going to kind of share some of them here,
Yeah.
cultivating global awareness and demonstrating empathy and applying the practice of knowledge for current events and civic action. Like those pieces they're not a standard to be learned discreetly. They're instead like an approach to teaching to this content. Within the standards themselves, there are some standards that also then will say something like using primary and secondary sources describe the causes of whatever. So there are a number of places where the essential disciplinary practice is actually embedded into the standard itself when we wanted to make sure that in third grade history that students were getting exposed to primary documents. And so calling it out specifically. So I think in that way, during the professional development, teachers are really thinking about the EDPs and like how they're structuring their classroom, we call them essential questions. Sometimes they're called compelling questions, right? So how those are being designed for each unit. So that's what's happening at the professional learning sessions. And then at the classroom level, as they're implementing the standards, they're seeing sometimes, like I said, embedded into the standards themselves. And then hopefully through the professional learning have really applied those EDPs throughout the unit.
That's a really great. I always think of it as if you're going to make a cake, you've got all the ingredients out and you can substitute ingredients. I see those as like the content standards. Sometimes you can add, sometimes you can take away, but the inquiry practices are the oven. You can't make the cake without the oven. There's no substitution for that.
Yeah, and just on that, I know I have some C4 friends in the room too today, but we've had this discussion in social science forever, like kind of the skills versus content piece, right?
Yeah.
And of course the answer is to do both.
Yes.
But it's really an appreciation, I think, and our standards really try to elevate the idea that to your analogy of the ingredients, like stirring and mixing and getting the temperature right on the oven, timing it, those skills are important. But like having a knowledge of like how the ingredients interact with one another, how the flavors, their profiles, like why unsalted butter and not butter, and if you're not going to play with the salt, just understanding all that is like what's really key to our social science standards, I think, is seeing we're not just saying it's just skills and it doesn't matter what you teach in social science. There are lots of important social science skills. Those are the EDPs. And then there's also some really pieces of content that we want to have shared knowledge across our system. Every third grader should have exposure to this kind of set of knowledge. And that's just the floor. Yep. There's, of course, much more that teachers can do to add on to that.
And that is what was added in the standards for Oregon, like a little bit more content in this time?
Yeah, we were more specific with the content within the standards, and then those examples. That's the example column is probably the thing that gets commented on most when I'm going around working with teachers. Is that both new teachers and veteran teachers are say like this helps explain where you want us to go, which was really the intent of those. Is just thinking about if you were seeing standards for the first time, what would you teach around this thing around like causes and practices and effects of wars. Well, which wars and what causes and what practices. So that kind of helped to give, again, those are just optional examples. You don't have to use those examples, but I think that just helped like trigger in the mind, like, okay, this is where we're going with this.
Yeah, I think to your point, it's always about the swinging pendulum, right? And I think there was a time, and we all remember it, and we probably had this kind of social studies education where it was all just fact nuggets and all content and no pedagogy whatsoever. And then maybe there was a swing to like, oh, let's just talk about skills and not talk about the content and the knowledge. I think finding a way that both of those are married is the real work of what we talk about when we're talking about standards materials to classrooms. But as you begin to take these materials on the road, what are you finding are the biggest challenges or the biggest opportunities of going out to districts and making the pitch for adopting instructional materials that are on the list that are high quality?
Yeah, I think these are going to be telling people what they already know. But for K-5 social science, of course, the issue is just time to teach social science. And so that's a national story. And in Oregon, it's often once a week and sometimes once every 2 weeks. In the K-5, really explaining sort of the value add of purchasing instructional materials for districts that are, like many other states also, really tight on budgets is a tough ask. And then for all the levels, though, because Oregon is really pivoting towards like curriculum-based professional learning.
Right.
So what we are hoping for is districts adopt instructional materials that then we can help them support curriculum or professional learning that's based on the curriculum that's adopted, right? So it's not agnostic. It's not just skills. It's okay. So what's the thing that's in your on page 7 or whatever? And so that, of course, also takes money, right? That's substitute time or summer PD or extended contract. So that is another sort of challenge, I think, for school districts is how are they going to do that? And oftentimes, also in Oregon, this might be true in other states as well, is that PD time that's built into the school year. So those days that there's no student contact, but the teachers are in the building, often those are teacher-directed days. They're not necessarily district-directed or administratively directed. And when do you get to capture some time to work directly with social science teachers on the new adopted materials? That's probably the biggest challenge going forward. Some of the structures we've done to support that, though, is we did run statewide. We ran 4 engagements last spring around the new standards. And this was prior to the instructional materials being completed, but it was launching for the new standards. And then in addition to that, we basically took those professional learning sessions and put them online. And so now there's a web page for Oregon educators, the Oregon Social Science Framework, that has sessions that like webinars that teachers can watch to unpack the standards, but then has over 100 different resources that they can use for the classroom that are aligned to our standards that would supplement many of our high quality instructional materials that we did adopt.
I'm sharing a resource with everyone, the district story from Canby. What did you see in that can translate to other districts, the reasons why they would adopt high quality instructional materials or some of the challenges or opportunities of that?
Yeah, I think looking at the Canby story, important for me to say all of our materials that were adopted are considered high quality instructional materials. And so the use of a particular publisher is not unique or dependent on their outcomes, right? But I think what it helped is that the publisher looked at our standards closely and understood the way the standards worked. And within our standards, there is already an inquiry mindset meant to be generated by the way that the standards are set up. And so like the framing for Oregon standards, the foundation is this idea of a more complete history, with this idea that things are unfinished and we're not sure that we got everything, but we're trying to do a little bit of a better job than last time. So a more complete. And this is a challenge to the previous standards, right? And it's asking the question, whose stories are underrepresented, whose stories need to be included. And those themselves are the kind of what is called compelling questions, or we call essential questions, like that you can set up through the standards at the beginning of a unit and start thinking about whose voice is here, whose voice is absent. I think the 2 big questions that we ask as educators, or should be asking ourselves who are thinking about the year coming up, is why are we teaching what we teach, and what do we want our students to get out of it? And that's a sort of a feedback loop, right? When you decide what you're going to teach, and the reasons usually are things like it's on a test, which is not true in Oregon, but it's on a test since we don't have a test. It's something that I really love to teach, or it's something that got handed to me and we have this stuff, so I'm going to teach it. And all those are good reasons to teach something, but just then the question about why, or what we want students to get out of it, and then figuring out if students are actually getting out of that. And then that allows us to think back to, are we teaching the right things? And I see that in the Canby story is that they're setting up, here's the outcomes we want for students. How are we going to get there? We've got these standards. What are the standards doing to allow us to bring in more perspectives, more complexity, to know that things are messy when you're dealing with social sciences as far as no simple answers? I think all of that I see in their story there. And they start each unit with this idea of students generating responses to a compelling question and then diving into primary and secondary documents from there, which again are like called out multiple times in our standards, right, to be using primary documents at a very young age, right? That we can get to photos and simple documents for students at a very young age.
Yeah. I think that with the Canby example leads us into welcome on Marlene Carroll, who is Assistant Superintendent for Teaching and Learning, and Jenny Larson, the teacher on special assignment for Teaching and Learning from Sherwood School District. Hi, Jenny and Marlene. It's great to have you here today.
Hi. Thank you for having us. Thank
Yeah,
you.
I'm so excited to hear your story because you've adopted a high quality instructional material. You've navigated the full journey. And while a lot of districts aren't making the step toward adopting high quality instructional materials, specifically for elementary social studies, you did. And I'm wondering what convinced you that was the right decision to make and what made you do it?
So, first, in our school district, we do follow a pretty robust framework for adopting instructional materials. That's really important to us. And then we do believe deeply in the research around high quality instructional materials has an impact on students. And that's not just in the core, but in all of the content areas. And so, this was important to us. It is part of a state baseline of education that you have high quality instructional materials in Oregon. Some elementary schools do choose to design their own. We at the time did not have capacity to do that or the expertise to do that. And so we really had to rely on our state partners and the instructional materials that were adopted at the state. At the time that we adopted our materials, they hadn't gone through our state process, but we had one of our jobs from our teaching and learning TOSA, like Jenny, is to look at what other states are doing, what they're adopting. If they're aligned with our criteria that we use in Oregon, then we look at those materials and resources as well. And our teachers, Jenny, you can step in at any time, but part of the initial process for us was to read the C3 framework as well. And that really started our elementary teachers, just that learning process of what could social science instruction look like. And that got them really excited to go deeper into instruction with students and make sure that they have the resources necessary to do their good work.
I think really just getting our teachers all together and grounded in a shared knowledge of what inquiry social science instruction would look like.
I mean, when you're going out to districts that are thinking about elementary social studies, there was specific desire for that in Sherwood. What is a blocker for other districts that you're talking to right now? Because Sherwood made the leap, others are not, specifically in elementary social studies. I know you said time, but are there other constraints that are getting in the way too?
I think Sherwood's example is what we hope for all of our districts is that they're really thinking intentionally about what's happening in K-5 social science and thinking about the materials they're using. Sounds like great professional learning was going on around the C3 framework, which was embedded in our standards. But I think that the block for, I mentioned money and the use of time, there is a fair amount of emphasis on literacy and math. And it's in the news. I will share that our state is very concerned with the scores that we recently received in ELA and math on the national test. And so there is a sort of a re-emphasis on that. And so we know that can be a pressure point for schools, whether it comes from the local level or above. I think schools oftentimes will double down on more minutes for those other areas. So that can be a challenge. And of course, for what's happening for teacher development, we don't often have a lot of social science specialists coming into K-5, right? So they spend much of their time in pre-service work on literacy and math. The passion for it, I think, is important. Like when we do have K-5 teachers that are very passionate about social science, then we see different outcomes in schools. But then just also the understanding just of how to blend social science with ELA. And that's a very natural connection, but it's sometimes because there's such a focus on direct ELA instruction, it's hard to think about how to bring in biographies or how to bring in map reading and those kinds of things is also literacy.
Back to Sherwood, these materials that are inquiry-based, high quality, can be a shift for teachers. What are the biggest challenges and the biggest successes of implementing these inquiry-aligned materials in your classrooms?
Good question. I think the challenges at first were just changing that mind shift from the teacher knows it all to the students are gathering knowledge. And so making that shift. Another challenge is just time and pacing. It can be hard for teachers to predict how long the inquiry process is going to take or some of the informed action projects at the end. And that first year when there's not a lot of background knowledge of the curriculum and where it's going, any curriculum, the first year of implementation usually takes longer. And then a common challenge is just the time in your schedule. to be dedicated to social science. And then some of the biggest successes were student engagement, really seeing students talk about social science outside of the classroom at lunch or PE and talking about some of their informed action projects they were doing, or having teachers just stop me and say, look at what we did. And they'll send me pictures of their informed action. And so really just the teacher engagement along with the student engagement has been a great success.
We had a question in the chat. How much do you struggle with teachers' own lack of social studies content knowledge or their perception of how that could hinder them?
I think we're continuing to help build the teachers' content knowledge of social science and, more importantly, the social history of our local Sherwood or our tribes around where we live. And so just really relying on our community partners and helping build that knowledge from their resources that they provide as well. Marlene, do you have anything to add to that?
The only thing that I would add is inquiry learning is all about curiosity, right? And building your knowledge. And it doesn't matter what age you are, you can do that. And so our teachers come back to us and their inquiry is different than maybe their approach to learning prior, especially elementary and social sciences. But they do come back to us and say, oh, I really learned some new things, or the students ask questions I wouldn't even consider asking, and we want that and we promote that. And I think if you go into your launch year with, we're all learning this, we're all students in this work, that feels right to the staff. And I think it feels good to the students, and it feels much more manageable when you frame it in that way.
It's almost like you're encouraging a mindset shift to deal with that question. That's great. How did the state standards and materials adoption, once they came out, or validate the work you were already doing?
Yes, the new state standards have been really useful for us. We did attend those professional learning sessions that Amit had mentioned, and we do want to find ways to have our teachers engage with those asynchronous learning modules. But what was very helpful that was added were those topic areas that Amit referred to. But sometimes seeing all those topic areas, teachers treat that as a checklist, that they have to teach all of those. And so really trying to wrap their heads around that it's not a checklist. These are just different ways you could teach the standards through those topics. And then having the domains just really clear of the different and across grade levels. So they'll see the same kind of setup. K-12, that was really helpful as well.
I think that I'd be curious to hear, Jenny and Marlene, looking back, if there's a district right now that's just at the beginning of this, what advice you might give to them?
One thing that at the district office level, you do have some control over is master scheduling, building out scope and sequence for courses with your teachers. So like the social science versus health that you have to squeeze into an elementary day. Things like whatever your standards are, do they lend themselves to an inquiry approach? Do your current materials lend themselves to inquiry? And looking at those to give yourself a scope of what kind of work you're going to need to tackle. And then bringing a team together and allowing time. It is not a year-long process. It's like just to adopt the materials, yes, but to do all the work along the way takes a lot more time. And it really does need to have a representative team of educators who are in the classroom. I think that's where I would start. If you haven't read the C3 framework or done your research, I would start there as well, because that's incredibly useful. If you're leading the work or facilitating the work, being an expert in it is really key.
I want to ask some final questions to our panelists. Amit, as you travel around, you go to a lot of different schools and you talk to a lot of different districts. What do you see that gives you a lot of hope and inspires you about the journey of social studies and in your state?
Yeah, what I've been seeing, really, I'm just going to shout it out outside of our standards, is Jennifer mentioned it, the travel history, shared history piece that we have. So we came out with lessons a few years ago that were meant to go along with the 2018 standards, but these were directly in support of our tribe, our 9 federally recognized tribes. And so just as I've gone through other districts watching them to integrate those lessons. And so those have been really great. And I think the way those are set up, we've now updated them to the new standards as well. That's a really nice thing to see, is the way that schools at the local level are really thinking about their connection to the tribes in the area and the story of the tribes of Oregon as well. And then when I'm called into a district, when I have that opportunity at an ESD or district level, it's because they're beginning the process of thinking about the new standards. And at the K-5 level, there is that building up of content knowledge a little bit, and then thinking about the ELA connections. Like, that's always a good sign. And then at the middle school and high school level, especially at the high school level, it's sitting down with what have they been teaching the last 7 years? And again, asking those questions about like why those things, and then what needs to shift. And our high school teachers are very passionate about what they're teaching and very sure that what they're doing is the right thing. And it is. But let's think about like how we're bringing in these new standards and the new perspectives as well. And what does that mean as far as like letting go or adding things? So those are always great discussions. And I think the best part of having a 7-year cycle is it gives districts and really teachers the opportunity to work together, because teaching is such a siloed activity. And for high schools, shut your door and teach kind of stuff. And so really having a 7-year cycle allows an excuse to bring a district together or bring K-5 together and really think about that arc of learning that students are going to have. And so when I see that happening, that's always a really good sign for what's to come, right? And we know that 3 years down the road, there'll be some divergence again. And some districts are off cycle and those kinds of things happen. But the idea of bringing groups of teachers together is really empowering for those teachers and for the subject matter, and of course, for our students.
Yeah. Thanks. And Jenny and Marlene, what about, as you see what's happening in classrooms in your district, what is giving you hope and inspiring you about social science in Oregon?
It's just really nice to have a partnership with our state department that provides resources and professional learning, so we don't feel so isolated. We do really feel supported, and to really have content specialists like Amit that we can rely on because as my position, I do all the subjects in elementary, so it is nice to have a specialist at the state level. And I think it's just exciting to see when students are excited to learn about social science. And my favorite is when they come up to me, "Did you know?" And they're teaching me. So that's the most exciting part about the inquiry process.
I do think what we saw right away that I think is the coolest part is the informed action, or the community action part. Our kids and our teachers that embrace that, even though it was really scary to do. But I think that service to your community is a value of our greater community here. And I think it's a value of Oregon in general, is service to community. And so it aligns really well with not just what our school district or our city is trying to do, but the community at large is do that.
Being able to transfer that knowledge and apply it is such a powerful way to learn. And it's what I think they'll remember. They won't remember the quiz they took, but they will remember when they had an opportunity to apply their knowledge and really make an impact. I just want to thank Jenny and Marlene and Amit for joining us. And I think Oregon is pretty lucky to have the social science leadership and the social science district level visionaries that you have. So thanks so much for joining us today.